It was supposed to be a normal day, just like any other. The kind of day where people walk into the Pawn Stars shop with old coins, dusty boxes, or strange collectibles they think might be worth something. Rick was behind the counter flipping through a book someone had brought in. Chumlee was making jokes in the back and Corey was busy checking an old watch. Everything felt calm. Everything felt right. But sometimes the most normal days can take the most unexpected turns. Outside, the sun was shining. People were lined up outside the gold and silver pawn shop, some just fans of the show, others hoping to make a deal. The air had that quiet buzz of Las Vegas heat and energy. Tourists were laughing, taking pictures, chatting about what they might see inside. No one knew what was coming, not even the people inside the store. Then something strange happened. A black car slowly pulled up in front of the shop. Not flashy, not loud, just a quiet, serious-looking car. Then another car pulled in behind it. Then a third. The people outside stopped talking. They stared. The doors opened. Men in suits stepped out. They weren't smiling. They weren't holding cameras, they weren't tourists, they were from the FBI. At first everyone thought maybe it was part of the show. Maybe it was some kind of setup for a new episode. Maybe Rick had bought something that turned out to be more valuable than they thought, and now the government wanted to see it. That kind of thing had happened before, though never with this kind of energy. There was something about the way these men moved. They weren't acting, they weren't laughing. They were serious. Focused. Rick walked toward them. He didn't look nervous, but you could tell he was thinking. Chumlee peeked from the back, clearly confused. Corey stepped closer to the front, looking at the men like he was trying to figure out if this was real. One of the agents pulled out a badge. There were a few short words exchanged. No one could hear what was said. But whatever it was enough for Rick to nod and step aside. The agents moved in, spreading out inside the shop. They didn't touch anything on the shelves. They didn't ask to see any items. They walked slowly, carefully, like they were looking for something very specific. And then one of them stopped. He pointed down at the floor, the same old wooden floor that had been there for years, walked on by thousands of people, used in hundreds of episodes. The floor that had always just been a floor. Rick raised an eyebrow. "There's nothing under there," he said, but even he didn't sound sure. The agent didn't answer. Instead, he spoke into a radio. A few minutes later, 2 more men came in. This time carrying tools. Big tools. Like something used on a construction site. One of them knelt down and knocked on the floor. Knock, knock, knock. Then he looked up and nodded. People started whispering. The tourists outside were now pressing up against the windows. Cameras were recording. Phones were out. The Pawn Stars team looked more confused than ever. No one had any idea what was going on. Then the noise started. Loud, sharp, sudden. One of the men had started pulling up the floorboards. Wood cracked, dust flew into the air. It was like something out of a movie. This wasn't a quiet check-in or a simple inspection. This was serious. This was real. And no one knew why. The sound of the floor breaking filled the room. Everyone went silent. Rick stepped back, arms crossed, watching carefully. Chumlee was no longer joking. Corey stood still, eyes locked on the scene. Something was happening and none of them could explain it. Time moved slowly. Minute by minute more boards came up. The agents were focused, careful, like they were expecting to find something hidden deep beneath the floor. But what? Why here? Why now? That was the question that hung in the air. Why would the FBI come to a pawn shop just to dig under the floor? What could possibly be buried there? Was it something left behind from the early days of the store? Was it something someone had hidden years ago? Could it be dangerous? Could it be connected to a crime? The team didn't have answers. Neither did the fans watching from outside, but curiosity was growing with every second. What if they found gold? What if they found something illegal? What if it changed everything people thought they knew about the shop? Rick looked down at the spot being torn up. His face showed something strange, not fear, but deep thought, like he was trying to remember something. Something from long ago. Maybe a story someone told him. Maybe something his dad once said about the early days of the shop. Maybe, just maybe, there was something hidden under there. And if there was, why now? Why did it take so many years for someone to come looking for it? No one had answers yet, but one thing was clear. The day had gone from normal to unforgettable in a matter of minutes. And this was just the beginning. Whatever the FBI was looking for, they believed it was important. Important enough to come in, unannounced, and tear up the floor of one of the most famous shops in America. People kept watching. Cameras kept rolling. But inside, something had shifted. The Pawn Stars team wasn't just thinking about the value of things anymore. They were thinking about the past, about secrets, about the idea that maybe even in a place filled with history, there were still things no one knew. And that's what made this moment so powerful. The curiosity, the questions, the mystery that seemed to rise up from under the floor. Because sometimes the most surprising things are hidden in the most familiar places. And sometimes the past finds a way to break through the surface. The quiet buzzing of the gold and silver pawn shop was replaced with a strange tension the moment those black cars pulled up. People inside the shop didn't know it yet, but their usual day was about to turn into something far more serious. The kind of day they would never forget. No one knew who these people were or why they were here. The cars had parked so quietly, almost like shadows in the middle of the day, and the figures stepping out were not like any customers Rick, Corey, or Chumlee had seen before. It was one of those moments when your gut tells you something isn't right, but your mind is struggling to figure out why. At first everyone thought maybe this was some kind of stunt. After all, the Pawn Stars show was famous for unexpected dramatic moments. But this was different. This wasn't part of a show. This wasn't some harmless surprise for the cameras. No, this felt serious. Very serious. The FBI wasn't a part of any plan. These weren't actors or extras. They were agents, and they had a job to do. Rick could feel it the moment one of them flashed a badge. It wasn't the usual handshakes and small talk that came with new customers. The agents didn't smile. They didn't ask if the guys wanted a tour of the shop. They just walked straight in, their eyes scanning everything, their movements methodical. Rick, never one to get rattled easily, took a step toward them. He had seen all kinds of things in the pawn business. Gold coins, rare historical pieces, strange people. But this was something different. He knew it immediately. The agents were here for something important. Something that had nothing to do with a pawned item or a big deal. They had a purpose, and it wasn't clear yet what that was. But the feeling of unease settled over Rick, and he had to shake it off. He had to stay calm. The shop was his business, and his job was to stay in control. "Can I help you?" Rick asked, trying to keep his voice steady. One of the agents, a tall man with a stern face, didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned to one of his colleagues, who pulled out a thick file. The folder was filled with papers, but what they contained was a mystery. No one inside the shop knew what was going on, and the agents weren't explaining themselves. There were no questions about valuable items. There were no polite introductions. They didn't care about the collectibles or the items on display. They had come here with a purpose, and it was something far bigger than what anyone had expected. Corey, who had been standing near the counter, shot a look at Rick. They exchanged glances. Neither of them knew what to make of the situation. Chumlee, always the joker, tried to lighten the mood. "Maybe they're here for some rare pawn items," he said, his voice just loud enough to break the tense silence. But even Chumlee knew this wasn't like anything they had experienced before. The agents weren't here for a deal. They were here to search. One of them, with the calm and precise movement of someone who had done this before, looked at Rick and said, "We need to examine your store. There's something we need to look into." Rick stood still, trying to digest what was happening. He could feel his heart start to race, but he had to keep it together. He couldn't let panic take over. The Pawn Stars shop had always been a safe place, a business built on years of trust and history. But this was out of the blue. The agents spread out. They weren't rushing, but they weren't wasting time either. They moved with purpose, their eyes scanning every corner, every shelf, every nook of the shop. The shop, once filled with the hustle and bustle of normal customers, was suddenly silent. People who had been browsing the shelves stepped back, their curiosity growing by the second. What was happening? Why the FBI? Outside, the crowd of tourists had stopped in their tracks. They were used to seeing Rick and the guys on TV, laughing and talking about bizarre items. But this was different. The agents didn't stop. They kept moving, heading deeper into the shop, their eyes fixed on the task at hand. No one knew what they were looking for, and that made everything feel even more unsettling. The agents didn't ask questions about the things they were seeing. They didn't show any interest in the objects people had brought in to pawn. Their eyes were focused on something else. One of the agents finally turned to Rick. "Where's your storage area?" he asked. Rick hesitated, still trying to make sense of what was going on. Why were they asking about storage? It didn't make sense. The store wasn't a warehouse. It was a pawn shop, where people came to buy and sell items. There wasn't anything hidden there. Or was there? Rick led the agents to the back of the shop, where the storage area was located. But even as they walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't like any investigation he had ever seen. These weren't the typical police officers doing a routine check. The way the agents acted, the way they moved, it was clear they were looking for something specific, something important, and the silence they carried made it feel even more serious. The agents took their time in the storage area, looking over the shelves, checking boxes, moving through the aisles. Rick's mind raced. Had something happened in the past? Something they hadn't known about? Was there something under the shop, hidden away all these years, that the FBI was now uncovering? The mystery of it all grew bigger with every passing moment. Why the sudden interest in this particular shop? Why now? Why hadn't anyone warned them? The Pawn Stars team had been in business for years, and yet this felt like a moment none of them had ever prepared for. As the minutes stretched on, the crowd outside grew bigger. Tourists with cameras started taking photos, trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on. But inside, things had gone from odd to serious. And the agents weren't just poking around for fun. They were methodical. They were looking for something specific. And whatever it was, it had a lot of people on edge. The Pawn Stars team didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. What the FBI had come for wasn't clear. But one thing was obvious. They weren't leaving without answers. And whatever those answers were, they would change everything. The curiosity grew stronger with each passing moment. What were they searching for? Was it something hidden under the floor? Or was it something much bigger than anyone had imagined? The question was out there, and it would only be a matter of time before the mystery was solved. Rick had seen it all in his years of running the Pawn Stars shop, the old collectibles, rare treasures, and even the occasional surprise item that left him speechless. But this was something completely different. The moment the FBI agents pulled out their tools, something inside Rick told him this was no longer just a normal visit. There was something far more serious going on. It wasn't a casual checkup or a simple inspection. No, this was a full-on search. And whatever they were looking for, it was hidden beneath the floor of his shop. At first, Rick didn't know what to think. The idea that someone would rip up the floor of the store he had worked so hard to build seemed unbelievable. But the look in the agent's eyes told him everything he needed to know. They were here for a reason, and that reason had something to do with what was buried under the shop's floor. It wasn't a normal search. This was real. This was serious. And it wasn't something Rick could ignore. Chumlee, who had been standing off to the side, now stepped forward. He watched in disbelief as the agents started pulling out tools from their bags. They weren't using ordinary tools either. These were heavy-duty tools, the kind used for serious construction or demolition. This wasn't a simple inspection. This was a team of people with a clear mission. Rick couldn't believe his eyes as one of the agents grabbed a crowbar and started prying up the first piece of the floor. The sound of wood creaking under pressure filled the air. It wasn't just a few boards. The agents were determined to remove large sections of the floor, one by one. With each new piece they pulled up, the mystery grew bigger. What could possibly be under the shop that needed this kind of attention? What was so important that it required breaking apart the very foundation of the building? The noise of the crowbar scraping against the wood echoed through the shop. Customers who had been browsing were now watching with wide eyes, their curiosity getting the best of them. Some of them began to whisper among themselves, trying to figure out what was going on. They had never seen anything like this. The Pawn Stars shop, famous for its fun and quirky atmosphere, had suddenly turned into a place of tension and uncertainty. Corey, who had been standing at the counter, exchanged a glance with Rick. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The look on Rick's face said it all. This was not something they could control. This was something far beyond them. The FBI agents weren't here to make deals or look at rare items. They were here to uncover something, and they were determined to find it. As the first few boards were removed, a layer of dust and dirt started to rise into the air. It was clear that this part of the floor hadn't been touched in years. The wood was old and cracked, showing signs of age. But underneath all of that, there was something hidden, something the agents were looking for. Rick couldn't help but feel a sense of dread growing inside him. What was it? Was it something from the past, a secret left behind by someone? Or was it something that had been planted there, something no one had ever expected? The agents worked quickly and efficiently, not stopping to answer any questions or explain what they were doing. Every few minutes, they would call out to each other in hushed tones, exchanging information that Rick couldn't quite understand. But one thing was clear. They were searching for something very specific. It wasn't just about tearing up the floor, it was about finding whatever had been hidden there. At this point, Rick couldn't help but wonder if there was something he didn't know. Maybe someone had left something behind in the shop years ago, something that had been forgotten over time. Maybe it was something valuable, something that had been buried to keep it safe. Or maybe it was something dangerous, something that had been hidden away to avoid detection. Whatever it was, Rick was starting to get the feeling that the past had come back to haunt them. As the search continued, the shop grew quieter. The agents were focused, moving with precision and purpose. They weren't rushing, but they weren't wasting any time either. Every second felt like it carried more weight than the last. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and Rick could feel it in his chest. Whatever was happening, it was serious. It wasn't something that could be brushed off. It wasn't something that could be ignored. The floor continued to come apart piece by piece, and with each new section that was removed, the mystery deepened. What were the agents hoping to find? Why did they feel the need to destroy the floor in order to uncover it? Rick had seen many things in his time at the shop, but nothing like this. Nothing that had made him question what was going on beneath his feet. It wasn't long before the agents uncovered something strange. There, hidden beneath the layers of dust and old wood, was a small compartment. It wasn't large, but it was there, and that was enough to send a shockwave through the room. Rick's heart skipped a beat. He could feel his mind racing. What was in that compartment? What had been hidden there all these years? The agents moved in quickly, carefully opening the compartment. Rick tried to get a glimpse of what was inside, but the agents were blocking his view. The suspense was unbearable. The room was filled with tension. Every eye was on the agents, waiting for them to reveal what had been hidden beneath the floor of the Pawn Stars shop for so long. And then, after what felt like an eternity, one of the agents pulled out an old dusty box. It wasn't large, but it was heavy. The agent carefully set it on the counter, and for a moment no one moved. Rick couldn't believe his eyes. What was in that box? Was it something valuable? Was it something that would change everything they thought they knew about the shop? The agents didn't open the box right away. They exchanged a few words discussing their next steps, but the curiosity in the room was growing by the second. Everyone wanted to know what was inside. Rick, Corey, Chumlee, and even the customers who had been watching the scene unfold were on the edge of their seats. As the agents continued their work, the tension in the room was palpable. Whatever had been hidden under the floor of the Pawn Stars shop was no longer just a mystery. It was the kind of discovery that could change everything. The agents were about to reveal something that would rock the very foundation of the shop, and no one knew what that was yet. But one thing was for sure, the story of the Pawn Stars shop would never be the same again. The tension in the room had reached its peak. Everyone inside the gold and silver pawn shop was waiting, holding their breath. The agents had pulled out a small dusty box from beneath the floorboards. It wasn't big, but its significance was growing with every second. The air was thick with anticipation. Rick, Corey, and Chumlee stood there, their eyes fixed on the box. Tourists outside, who had been peering through the windows, were just as curious. What could possibly be inside this box? And why had the FBI gone through so much trouble to unearth it? The agents didn't speak. They were quiet, their faces serious as they placed the box gently on the counter. The shop, which had always been filled with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of coins, was now silent. The only sound was the distant hum of Las Vegas outside, a stark contrast to the silence within. Rick's mind was racing. He had been through thousands of items over the years, but nothing like this. Nothing had ever felt this important. The agents weren't just here for a normal search. They weren't interested in rare coins or ancient artifacts. This was different. This was something that could change everything. But what was inside this little box that was causing all the mystery? Corey was the first to speak, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "So what's in it?" he asked, his eyes glued to the box. It was a question everyone was dying to ask, but no one had the answer yet. The agents were slow. They were taking their time. They didn't seem eager to open the box. Instead, they were carefully inspecting it, as if they were preparing for something that required great caution. Rick could feel his curiosity growing by the second. What could possibly be inside? Was it something valuable? Or was it something dangerous? Rick stood there, arms crossed, watching the agents closely. He couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Whatever was in that box, it had been hidden for a reason. Someone had made sure it stayed buried beneath the floor of the shop for years, and now it was being revealed. But why now? Why was it so important that the FBI had come all the way to the Pawn Stars shop to uncover it? The agents exchanged glances, and finally one of them nodded. He carefully untied the string that was wrapped around the box. The simple act felt almost ceremonial, like they were opening a door to something that had been locked away for a very long time. The anticipation in the room was unbearable. Everyone was on edge. Rick, Corey, Chumlee, and the customers who had been watching were all waiting for the moment when the box would finally be open. It was like waiting for a movie's big reveal, but no one knew what the twist would be. No one knew what the ending would look like. The only thing they knew was that this was no ordinary moment. This was something that would change the way they looked at the Pawn Stars shop forever. The agent slowly lifted the lid of the box. The room grew even quieter, if that was even possible. The only sound was the rustling of the agent's hands as he moved the contents of the box. Rick's heart pounded in his chest. What could it be? A hidden treasure? A piece of history that had somehow ended up in the wrong hands? Or was it something that would turn the Pawn Stars shop into a completely different kind of story? As the lid was fully opened, Rick leaned in, his curiosity getting the best of him. He tried to get a glimpse of what was inside, but the agents were blocking his view. The suspense was almost too much to handle. Corey shifted on his feet, unable to stand still. Chumlee, usually so relaxed and joking, was now tense, his eyes wide, watching the agent's every move. Finally, the agent pulled out the first item from the box. It wasn't gold or a rare coin. It wasn't a piece of ancient art or a treasure worth millions of dollars. Instead, it was a set of old yellowed documents. Rick's eyebrows furrowed in confusion. What were these? He had expected something far more dramatic, something that would change everything. But documents? What could these old papers have to do with the Pawn Stars shop? The agent didn't say anything right away. He slowly spread the documents out on the counter, letting everyone get a good look. The papers were delicate, worn with age. They seemed to be some kind of legal documents, but Rick couldn't make out the words. It was hard to see through the dust and grime that had built up over the years. Corey leaned forward, squinting at the papers. "What is this?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. He asked, his voice full of disbelief.
What size gets?
His voice full of disbelief. Rick, trying to hide his own confusion, stepped closer. He glanced down at the documents, trying to figure out what they were. They were clearly old, maybe from decades ago, but what was their connection to the Pawn Stars shop? Why had someone gone through the trouble of hiding them beneath the floor all these years? The agents were still silent, as if they were waiting for something. They didn't look at the documents the way a typical collector would. They weren't admiring them or studying them. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something else to be revealed. Rick could sense that there was more to these papers than met the eye. Whatever was written on them, it was important. It was why the FBI had come here. But what did they say? The agent who had opened the box stood back, allowing Rick to inspect the papers. Rick carefully picked one up. The paper was brittle, like it might crumble into dust if he wasn't careful. His hands shook slightly as he turned it over. The document had a seal on it, something official. But what did it mean? Was it a contract? A will? Some sort of agreement from years ago? As Rick inspected the papers, he started to see the connection. These weren't just any documents. They were linked to the shop's past, to the history that had been buried, literally, beneath the floor. Rick's mind began to race. Could this have something to do with the original owner of the shop? Was it related to a deal that had been made long ago? A deal that had been hidden away for some reason? The more he looked, the more questions he had. Who had put these documents under the floor? Why had they been hidden there? And why was the FBI so interested in them now? The answer, Rick knew, wasn't going to come easily. But as the pieces of the puzzle slowly started to come together, one thing became clear. Whatever was in that box, whatever these documents were, they had the potential to change everything. The Pawn Stars shop, which had always been a place of history and valuable items, was now at the center of a much bigger story. A story that had been hidden beneath the floorboards for years, and Rick, along with everyone else in the shop, was about to find out just how deep this mystery went. The shop was still eerily quiet. The once bustling gold and silver pawn shop had become a place of heavy silence. The only sounds were the soft rustling of papers as the agents carefully examined the old documents pulled from the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Rick, Corey, and Chumlee stood there staring at the papers, their minds racing. They had no idea what the documents were or why they were so important, but one thing was certain: these papers were connected to something bigger than they could have ever imagined. As Rick stood there holding one of the yellowed pieces of paper, a cold wave of uncertainty washed over him. He had been in the pawn business for a long time, but he had never encountered anything like this. The FBI didn't show up for a simple pawn deal. They didn't tear up floors for something insignificant. Whatever was written on these papers, it had to be significant. It had to be important. Corey, who had been trying to make sense of it all, leaned in and whispered, "Do you think this has something to do with the history of the shop? Maybe something we don't know about?" He sounded nervous, as if trying to voice the questions that were running through everyone's minds. Rick didn't know how to answer. He couldn't just say yes without knowing for sure. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. These documents hidden beneath the floor for so long had to be connected to the shop's past in some way. But how? And why had they been buried? The agents didn't seem interested in answering questions right now. They were too focused on the documents in front of them. Rick could see their faces as they scanned the papers. They weren't just looking at them, they were analyzing every word, every signature, as if they were searching for something specific. The way they handled the documents made it clear that they knew exactly what they were looking for. It was frustrating for Rick. He wanted to know too. He needed to know what all this meant for his business, his shop, and his future. It wasn't long before one of the agents spoke up, breaking the silence. "These documents are part of a larger investigation. We're looking for something that's been hidden for a long time, and these papers are the key." The words hit Rick like a punch to the gut. A larger investigation, what was going on? What had he gotten himself into? Rick's mind raced. He tried to process the agent's words, but they didn't make sense. What was the investigation? What were they looking for? And why was it tied to his pawn shop? He had always prided himself on running a legitimate business. He had never been involved in anything illegal. He had built the Pawn Stars shop from the ground up. But now he felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. It was as if something he had never seen, something he had never known, was being uncovered. Corey was the next to speak, his voice trembling slightly. "So, are you telling us that there's more to this place than we thought?" His question hung in the air, the weight of it making the room feel even colder. Was there something hidden beneath the shop that no one had ever known about? Was there some dark secret that had been buried with the floorboards? The idea was terrifying. Rick had never imagined that his shop could be a part of something so much bigger, something so mysterious. The agent nodded, still not giving much away. "Yes. These documents are connected to something from the past. Something that goes beyond the shop's history. Something that reaches back further than you could possibly imagine." Rick's heart pounded in his chest. What did that mean? What had been hidden here? What kind of secrets had been buried for so long? And why hadn't he known about them? As the agent continued to flip through the papers, Rick felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could something like this have been kept a secret for so long? It wasn't just about the business now. It wasn't just about the pawn shop. It was about his reputation, his livelihood, and the future of everything he had worked so hard to build. If there was something illegal or shady in these documents, it could ruin everything. His shop, his reputation, his family, all of it could be at risk. The agents continued their work, but Rick couldn't stand still any longer. He stepped forward, trying to get a better look at the papers. "What exactly are we looking at here?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "What do these papers have to do with my shop?" The agent turned toward him, his face serious. "These documents are part of a series of transactions that happened many years ago. Transactions that were kept secret for a reason." The agent paused, allowing his words to sink in. "This investigation is about uncovering what happened during those transactions. And these documents are the key to understanding it." Rick felt a chill run down his spine. Transactions kept secret for a reason. What kind of transactions were they talking about? What had happened in the past that was so important, so secret, that it had to be buried beneath the floor of his shop? The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was waiting for the agent to continue, but he didn't. He seemed to be waiting for something. Rick could feel his pulse quicken. Whatever it was coming. The revelation, the truth, the answers, they were just out of reach. Finally, the agent flipped to the last document in the stack. It was sealed with a wax emblem, an old symbol that Rick didn't recognize. He leaned in, trying to make out the details. The agent took a deep breath and slowly broke the seal, revealing the final piece of the puzzle. Rick couldn't help but feel that whatever was on that document was going to change everything. The room was tense, each person waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. What was it? What did this document say? Why was it so important? The agent held the paper up, allowing Rick and the others to get a glimpse of it. The writing was old, faded, and hard to read. But one word stood out, a name. A name that Rick had heard before but never paid much attention to. The name was tied to something in the past, something that had always seemed distant. But now, with this document, it seemed that the past was finally catching up to the present. Rick felt his stomach drop. The name on the document wasn't just any name. It was tied to a key figure in the history of the Pawn Stars shop. A figure whose past had been hidden away. A figure whose secrets were buried beneath the very floor of the shop he had spent his life building. What did it all mean? What would happen next? And how would this discovery change everything Rick had ever known about his shop and the world he had created? The answers were just out of reach, but they were coming. And once they were revealed, nothing in the Pawn Stars shop would ever be the same again. The tension in the air was thick, and no one in the gold and silver pawn shop could shake off the feeling that something big was happening. The agents were still here, and they weren't in any hurry to leave. As Rick and Corey looked at the documents, the reality of the situation began to sink in. What had seemed like a normal day at the shop had quickly turned into something they never expected. The more they learned, the more it became clear their lives were about to change forever. Rick was trying to make sense of it all. The FBI didn't just show up at random. They didn't just start tearing up floors for no reason. Something was going on, and whatever it was much bigger than a simple investigation. The documents were part of a larger story, one that connected the past and present in ways that no one could have predicted. But what was the story? What was the FBI looking for? And why was it tied to the Pawn Stars shop? The agents, however, were giving away very little. They weren't talking about the details of the investigation. They weren't telling Rick, Corey, or Chumlee what they were really searching for. They only spoke in cryptic hints. The only thing they were certain of was that these documents were crucial. They were the key to unlocking something far bigger than they had imagined. But what? That was the million-dollar question. The agents flipped through the pages of the documents, as if they were looking for something specific. Every time they turned a page, the room seemed to grow heavier. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Rick could feel the weight of it. Every second felt like an eternity. He needed answers. The shop, his livelihood, everything he had worked for was at risk. The last thing he wanted was for his reputation to be dragged through the mud, but that seemed like a very real possibility. If the FBI was involved, it meant something big. Something they had been hiding for years. Corey was pacing back and forth, his mind clearly racing. "Dad, what is going on?" he asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "This isn't just about some old documents. There's something else, something we don't know about. What aren't they telling us?" Rick couldn't answer. He didn't know. He had built this shop on trust, on transparency, but now everything seemed uncertain. He had never thought that his shop, the place where he made a living, would be caught up in something this dark. The FBI wasn't here to investigate a simple theft or fraud. They were here for something far more complex, something far more dangerous. Chumlee, usually the joker, was silent. He had no jokes or wisecracks to make. He knew that this wasn't something to laugh about. It felt as though the floor beneath them was crumbling, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the fall. And with every minute that passed, they moved closer to that fall. The agents continued their quiet search, flipping through more and more pages. They weren't explaining what they were doing, but it was clear they were piecing something together. The documents were part of a larger puzzle, one that no one in the shop had seen coming. And the more Rick thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about the shop. It was about something much bigger, something that connected back to people and events long before the Pawn Stars show had even started. Rick's thoughts went back to the name he had seen earlier. The name that had been on that last document, the name that had sent a chill down his spine. It was a name he had heard in passing before, but never really thought much about. It was a name tied to the shop's history, but now with everything happening, Rick knew that this was no coincidence. This name, this person, had to be involved in whatever was going on. The question was how. What role did they play in all of this? Corey couldn't sit still any longer. "Dad, we need to know what's going on. This is bigger than just us. This is about more than just the shop. What if there's something we don't know? What if it goes back to the beginning?" Rick took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I don't know, Corey," he said quietly. "But whatever it is, we're in this together, and we'll figure it out. We've always done that." But even as he said the words, Rick felt a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. Could they really figure it out? Could they handle whatever was coming their way? The agent who had been leading the search suddenly stopped flipping through the papers. He looked up at Rick, Corey and Chumlee, his face serious. These documents are part of a much larger investigation into a network of individuals and organizations that were operating in this area years ago, he said, his voice low but firm. Some of the people involved are well known. Others are less visible. But what they were doing was dangerous. And they were covering their tracks in ways that most people wouldn't even imagine. Rick's mind was spinning. A network, dangerous people. What did this have to do with the Pawn Stars shop? And what were they covering up? Corey looked at Rick, his face filled with concern. Are we involved in this? Did we unknowingly get caught up in something like this? Rick didn't know how to answer. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to think that the Pawn Stars shop, his business, could be connected to something criminal. But the more he heard, the more it seemed possible. The FBI was looking for something specific, and it had something to do with the past. But what? The agent didn't give much away. He simply nodded. The investigation is ongoing, and we're still uncovering the full extent of it. But these documents are a crucial part of the puzzle. They give us insight into how the network operated, where it was based, and who was involved. Rick's thoughts raced again. If the network was connected to the Pawn Stars shop in any way, it meant that his family, his business, and everything he had worked for could be in danger. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was serious. The silence in the shop grew again, but this time it was heavier. Rick didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just another day at the Pawn Stars shop. The investigation was just beginning, and whatever secrets were buried beneath the floorboards of his shop were about to come to light. The agents weren't leaving anytime soon. They had their eyes set on something, and they weren't going to stop until they uncovered every detail. Rick, Corey, and Chumlee could only wait and wonder what the next chapter of their lives would look like. But one thing was clear, the Pawn Stars shop would never be the same again. And as much as they hoped to uncover the truth, they also had to brace themselves for what it might mean for their future.